My sister wanted to take my share of the inheritance for herself. She tried to steal $750,000, but I filed a lawsuit in time. My aunt was keeping the money, but my sister said, after my dad died, life felt like it had been completely upended. He wasn't just my dad. He was my guide, my anchor. At 19, I wasn't prepared for a life without him. My older sister, Amy, was preoccupied with her wedding to Nick, a guy who was polite enough but never felt close to me. Amy was always the strong-willed one in the family, constantly trying to steer the ship, even when no one wanted her to. When my dad passed, Amy barely hesitated to suggest I move in with her and Nick. But that didn't feel right. She was in her own world, focused on dress fittings and venue arrangements. Aunt Lori stepped in almost immediately, offering me a place to stay. She wasn't just offering a room. She was offering stability in the middle of chaos. Lori lived in a picturesque, well-kept house about 3 hours away from where we grew up. She was my dad's younger sister, fiercely independent and always unapologetically herself. Her house was one of those places that smelled like fresh laundry and cinnamon, and everything had its place. It was comforting in a way I hadn't realized I needed. From the beginning, Lori made it clear she wasn't going to let Amy run the show. When Amy called Lori to discuss my future, Lori shut her down before she could get very far. "He needs space to grieve," Lori said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And he's staying with me for as long as he needs." Amy didn't take rejection well. She called me almost daily, sometimes to check in, but mostly to drop hints about how Nick and she could help me get on my feet. Her words felt suffocating, like she was trying to box me into her vision of what my life should look like. But Lori, with her calm yet firm demeanor, became a buffer between us. For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone had my back. Living with Lori was an adjustment, but not in a bad way. She had a golden retriever named Max, who immediately decided I was his new best friend. The house had this quiet rhythm to it, nothing like the chaos I'd known with Amy. Lori and I fell into an easy routine. She'd head to work early for her event planning business, and I'd spend my mornings figuring out what to do with myself. Sometimes I'd help her with small tasks, like organizing decorations or packing event supplies. It was a distraction, and I needed that. Amy's calls didn't stop, though. She'd ask how I was doing, then slip in questions about when I'd be coming to visit her and Nick. I could tell she wasn't used to not being in control, and it frustrated her. Once, she even showed up unannounced. I came home from running errands to find her sitting in Lori's living room, her arms crossed and a tight smile on her face. "We need to talk," she said, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she used when she wanted something. Lori stood in the kitchen, clearly annoyed but trying to stay polite. Amy went on about how it was best for everyone if I moved in with her and Nick. She claimed Lori must be too busy to keep me around, that I'd be better off in a more permanent environment. Lori let her finish, then calmly said, "He's staying here, Amy." End of discussion. Amy stormed out after that, leaving behind an awkward tension that took hours to dissipate. But Lori just shrugged it off and made us both tea, saying, "She'll get over it." I wasn't so sure. Amy didn't let go of things easily. Despite the occasional drama, life with Lori felt stable, even peaceful. We had our routines, walks with Max, evenings spent watching old movies, and quiet conversations about my dad. Lori didn't push me to talk, but she listened when I did. It was the first time since Dad's death that I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was starting to heal. Still, I knew Amy wasn't done. She didn't like losing control, and I had a feeling she'd be back to stir things up again. But for now, I was grateful for the space Lori had given me. A chance to breathe, to figure out who I was without Dad, and to decide what came next on my own terms. When my dad passed away, everything felt like it was ripped out from under me, including the stability I didn't even realize he'd been providing. One of the last things he left behind, aside from the memories, was a sizable inheritance. That inheritance became the source of more trouble than I could have anticipated. Dad had always been cautious with money. He worked hard, saved more than he spent, and made sure we never wanted for anything growing up. When he died, his estate included a house, a life insurance policy, and a carefully managed investment account. After the dust settled, It turned out he'd left behind nearly $1.5 million, which was split evenly between Amy and me. On paper, that should have been straightforward. But when is family drama ever simple? Amy, being the older sibling and well into her adult life, received her half outright. My half, however, about $750,000, was placed in a trust. I wouldn't have access to it until I turned 21, and Aunt Lori was named as the trustee. At first, I thought it made sense. I was 19, grieving, and Lori was the only one who seemed to have my best interests at heart. But Amy had other thoughts. She wasn't happy about the arrangement, and she didn't bother hiding it. On one of her now frequent calls, she brought it up. "It's ridiculous," she said, her tone sharp. "Why should Lori control your money? It's yours." "Because Dad didn't think I was ready," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure myself. "It's just a couple of years." "That's not the point," she snapped. "She's not even immediate family like I am. If anyone should have been the trustee, it should have been me." I didn't have the energy to argue. Amy had a way of making everything about control. Even when we were kids, she'd boss me around, telling me what to wear, how to act, or who I should be friends with. This wasn't about money, it was about power. And Lori, much to Amy's dismay, wasn't someone who could be manipulated. Lori took her role as trustee seriously. She met with financial advisors, kept detailed records of the trust, and even opened a separate account for me where she deposited small amounts monthly to cover personal expenses. It wasn't lavish, but it was enough to get by without feeling like a burden. For the first time in my life, I felt what financial stability could look like, even if it wasn't fully in my hands yet. Things started getting complicated when Amy began showing up at Lori's house unannounced. It happened first on a Saturday afternoon. Lori and I were in the backyard, raking leaves, when Amy's car pulled into the driveway. She came storming through the side gate, her face flushed with anger. "We need to talk," she said, not even bothering with pleasantries. Lori leaned on her rake and crossed her arms. "Hello to you too, Amy." Amy ignored her and turned to me. "Do you even know what she's doing with your money?" Lori raised an eyebrow. "I can assure you, everything is documented." Amy waved her off. "That's not the point. The point is, you're not his mother, Lori. You don't get to decide what's best for him." "I'm not deciding anything," Lori replied calmly. "Your father did." The conversation escalated quickly. Amy accused Lori of being controlling, and Lori countered by pointing out Amy's pattern of trying to dominate every situation. I stood there awkwardly, caught between them, unsure of what to say or do. Eventually, Lori told Amy to leave, and after a lot of huffing and puffing, she did. But that wasn't the end of it. A few weeks later, Amy invited me to dinner at her house. Nick was working late, so it was just the two of us. I should have known it wasn't just a casual sibling hangout. The second the food was served, she launched into her real agenda. "Don't you think it's weird that Lori has so much control over your money?" she asked, her tone deceptively sweet. "She's the trustee," I said, already feeling defensive. "But what if she's not handling it right? Do you even see the statements? Do you know how much is in there?" "She shows me everything," I said, though I realized it wasn't entirely true. Lori had offered to show me the financials, but I never asked to see them. I trusted her. Amy leaned in, lowering her voice like we were conspiring. "What if she's skimming off the top? You wouldn't even know." "She wouldn't do that," I said, but the seed of doubt was planted. I tried to shake it off, but Amy was relentless. "You need to start asking questions," she said. "It's your money, not hers." The conversation left me feeling uneasy. I didn't think Lori was capable of doing something shady, but Amy's words lingered. When I got home, I mentioned the dinner to Lori. Amy said I should be keeping a closer eye on the trust. I told her. Lori didn't look surprised. Of course she did. Amy's trying to stir up trouble. But is there anything I should know? She sighed and handed me a thick folder. "Here. These are all the statements and documents. Look them over if you want, but I promise you, everything is above board." I spent the next hour combing through the papers. Every deposit, withdrawal, and investment was meticulously documented. If anything, Lori was overly cautious. I felt a wave of guilt for even doubting her. The drama didn't end there. A few months later, I got a call from a lawyer. Amy had filed a petition to have Lori removed as trustee, claiming she was mismanaging the funds. I was furious. "What are you doing?" I demanded when I called her. "Protecting you," she said, as if she were doing me a favor. "You're not protecting me. You're just trying to control me." She didn't deny it. Instead, she doubled down, insisting that Lori couldn't be trusted. The legal battle dragged on for months, draining time and energy from everyone involved. In the end, the court sided with Lori, dismissing Amy's claims as baseless. But the damage was done. My relationship with Amy, already strained, was now hanging by a thread. Lori tried to reassure me, saying Amy would eventually come around, but I wasn't so sure. It felt like the family I had left was crumbling before my eyes, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Through it all, Lori remained steadfast. She reminded me that my dad had trusted her for a reason, and she wouldn't let him, or me, down. For that, I was grateful, even if the road ahead still felt uncertain. When Dad's inheritance was divided, Amy and I both got $750,000. At first, Amy seemed thrilled, but looking back, I should have seen the warning signs. Amy had always had a flair for the dramatic, a taste for luxury, and an impulsive streak that worried everyone except herself. As soon as the money hit her account, it was like she'd been handed a blank check for chaos. Amy didn't waste any time. Within weeks, she showed up at Lori's house in a brand new SUV, a top-of-the-line luxury model with features I didn't even know existed. The price tag? At least $100,000, probably more. She bragged about the heated seats, the panoramic sunroof, and the custom leather interior like it was the best decision she'd ever made. Lori raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Later, when Amy left, she shook her head. "That money's not going to last her long if she keeps this up," she muttered. I nodded but didn't say much. Amy had always lived in a world where consequences didn't seem to apply to her. I figured she'd learn eventually. But Amy didn't learn. Over the next few months, her spending escalated. She and Nick went on not one but 3 trips to Europe. I saw the photos on her Instagram, posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, lounging on a yacht in Italy, sipping champagne in Santorini. Each picture screamed luxury, and each one made me feel a little more uneasy. She even redecorated her entire house, replacing perfectly good furniture with designer pieces that probably cost more than my college tuition. Things took a darker turn when Nick got sick. It started with him complaining about back pain. At first, they thought it was just a slip disc, but after weeks of tests, they discovered he had a rare condition that required immediate surgery. The procedure wasn't just risky, it was expensive. Over $300,000, to be exact. Amy didn't handle the news well. She called me in tears, her voice shaking. "Nick needs this surgery, or he could be paralyzed," she said. "We've already maxed out our insurance. I don't know what to do." I felt bad for her. I really did. But there was nothing I could do. My share of the inheritance was locked in a trust, and even if it wasn't, I wasn't sure I wanted to hand over my future because of Amy's poor financial decisions. "Have you talked to Lori?" I asked, knowing full well that Lori would be skeptical about handing over any money. Amy sniffled. "She doesn't understand. She keeps talking about budgets and consequences. Nick could die, and all she cares about is paperwork. That's not fair," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "Lori's just doing what Dad wanted." Amy didn't respond, but I could tell she wasn't hearing me. She had a way of tuning out anything that didn't align with what she wanted. A week later, Amy showed up at Lori's house uninvited. I was sitting in the living room when I heard her car pull into the driveway. She stormed in, her face red with anger. "Why won't you help me?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to startle Max, Lori's golden retriever. Lori emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Hello, Amy. Nice to see you too." "This isn't a joke, Lori," Amy snapped. "Nick needs that surgery, and you're sitting on $750,000 that could save his life." Lori sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "It's not my money, Amy. It's his," she said, gesturing to me. "And it's in a trust. I can't just take it out because you made poor financial choices." Amy turned to me, her eyes pleading. "You can overrule her, you know? It's your money." Just tell her to release it. I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of her expectations. I can't, Amy. It's not that simple. It is that simple, she yelled. You're just being selfish. Selfish? Lori cut in, her voice sharp. You've burned through $750,000 in less than a year. And now you want to guilt him into giving up his future? That's not how this works. The argument escalated from there. Amy accused Lori of being heartless. Lori fired back about Amy's irresponsibility, and I just sat there, feeling like a bystander in my own life. Eventually, Lori told Amy to leave, and she did, slamming the door behind her. A few days later, Amy tried a different tactic. She started texting me every day, alternating between guilt trips and emotional manipulation. One day, she'd send me pictures of Nick in the hospital, looking pale and frail. The next, she'd send long paragraphs about how Dad would have wanted me to help her. It was exhausting, and I didn't know how to respond. I tried to talk to Lori about it, but she was firm. You can't let her bully you into giving up your money, she said. That trust is there for a reason. Your dad wanted to make sure you had a future, but what if Nick dies? I asked, feeling torn. Lori sighed. That's not your responsibility. Amy and Nick made their choices. You can't fix their mistakes. The situation reached a breaking point when Amy showed up at Lori's office. She burst in during a meeting, causing a scene in front of Lori's clients. I wasn't there, but Lori told me about it later. She was screaming about how I was letting her husband die, Lori said, shaking her head. It was humiliating. After that, Lori filed for a restraining order. It felt extreme, but Amy had crossed so many lines that it didn't seem like there was any other choice. For weeks, I didn't hear from Amy. It was eerie, like the calm before a storm. Then, one night, I got a call from Nick. His voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. She's gone, he said. What do you mean, gone? She left, took the car, emptied what was left of our savings, and disappeared. I didn't know what to say. Despite everything, I never thought Amy would abandon Nick, especially not when he needed her the most. But then again, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. Amy had always put herself first, no matter the cost. I told Lori about the call, and she wasn't shocked. She'll turn up eventually, she said. People like Amy always do. Lori was right. Amy resurfaced a few months later, but by then, everything had changed. Nick had moved in with his parents. Lori had tightened the trust even further, and I had learned a painful lesson about family, money, and the limits of loyalty. Amy's desperation hit a new level after Nick's condition worsened and the bills piled up. At first, her manipulative tactics were limited to direct pleas and guilt-tripping me, but when she realized I wasn't giving in, she turned to other strategies. Her campaign of emotional manipulation under the guise of family values became relentless, dragging in people I hadn't spoken to in years. It started with the photos. One morning, I woke up to a message from Amy with several images attached. They were of Nick in the hospital. He looked pale and frail, hooked up to machines with wires and tubes everywhere. The caption read, "Do you really want this on your conscience? Dad wouldn't have turned his back on us." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't that I didn't feel sympathy for Nick. I did. But this wasn't fair. She was trying to make me responsible for their situation, and it wasn't my fault. I showed the messages to Aunt Lori later that day. She took one look at them and frowned. "She's not going to stop," Lori said. "But you can't let her manipulate you like this. It's emotional blackmail." "I know," I said, feeling conflicted. "But it's hard to ignore." Lori placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Amy made her choices. This is on her, not you." The next wave of Amy's manipulation came in the form of phone calls, not just to me, but to Lori and other members of the family. She started reaching out to distant relatives, people we only saw at weddings or funerals, and spun her sob story. My cousin Derek, who lived out of state, called me one evening, completely blindsided by what Amy had told him. "She said Lori is withholding money that could save Nick's life," Derek said, his voice laced with concern. "Is that true?" "No," I replied, feeling my frustration bubble up. "The money isn't a trust. It's not even up to Lori to release it." "Well, Amy's making it sound like you and Lori are just sitting on a pile of cash while Nick is dying, Derek said. I mean, what's the point of family if we don't help each other? That phrase, what's the point of family, became Amy's mantra. She used it in every conversation, every message, every plea. It wasn't just Derek. She contacted my Aunt Karen, who hadn't spoken to Lori in years, and even tracked down my dad's cousin Ed, a man I barely remembered from a family reunion when I was 10. Soon, I was fielding calls and texts from people who barely knew me, all of them asking why I wasn't helping Amy save her husband. One evening, Lori and I sat down to strategize. The constant pressure was starting to wear on both of us. Lori had received an angry voicemail from Aunt Karen earlier that day, accusing her of being heartless and greedy. She said we're letting Nick die, Lori said, rolling her eyes. This is ridiculous. Half these people don't even know the full story. They only know what Amy's telling them, I said. And you know she's not telling them the truth. Lori sighed. Maybe it's time we set the record straight. We decided to reach out to a few of the relatives Amy had dragged into the situation, starting with Derek. Lori called him first, explaining the reality of the trust and the fact that Amy had already blown through her share of the inheritance. Derek was shocked. She didn't mention any of that, he said. She made it sound like you were hoarding all the money for yourselves. After the call, Derek apologized and promised to talk to a few other relatives to clear up the misinformation. But for every person we managed to convince, Amy found someone new to target. The tipping point came when Amy showed up at Lori's house with a new ally in tow, our second cousin Becca. I hadn't seen Becca in years. She was one of those people who love drama and always seemed to be in the middle of some family feud. I should have known Amy would enlist her. The two of them barged into the house like they owned the place. Amy had a folder of papers in her hand, which she slapped down on the kitchen table. This is proof that Nick's surgery can't be delayed any longer, she said, her voice trembling with anger. You have the power to save him, and you're choosing not to. Lori looked unimpressed. Hello, Becca. Nice to see you again. Becca crossed her arms and glared. Amy told me everything. I can't believe you're letting this happen. There's nothing to let happen, Lori said calmly. The money is in a trust, and it's not up for discussion. Amy pointed at me. It's his money. If he wants to release it, you can't stop him. It's not that simple, Amy, I said, feeling my face flush. You know that. Don't you care about family? Becca chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. What would your dad think if he saw you turning your back on Amy and Nick? Lori had had enough. She stood up, her expression icy. My brother would be heartbroken to see how Amy has handled the money he left her. And he'd be furious that she's trying to bully her brother into fixing her mistakes. Amy's face turned red. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Lori shot back. You burned through $750,000 in less than a year. And now you want to guilt him into giving you more. This isn't about family. It's about you refusing to take responsibility for your actions. The confrontation ended with Amy storming out, dragging Becca with her. But the damage was already done. The family was divided, with some relatives siding with Amy and others supporting Lori and me. It felt like every day brought a new accusation, a new conflict, a new wave of drama. The last straw came when Amy tried to go public with her story. She posted a long, emotional rant on social media, complete with photos of Nick in the hospital and vague references to family betrayal. The post went viral within our extended network, and the messages started pouring in. Some people offered support, but others were downright cruel. Lori received a barrage of hate mail, accusing her of being a greedy, heartless monster. I even got a few threatening messages from people who believed Amy's version of events without question. Lori eventually had to involve a lawyer to address the defamation. It was a messy, painful process, but it was the only way to protect ourselves from Amy's escalating manipulation. The lawyer drafted a cease and desist letter, warning Amy to stop spreading false information or face legal consequences. It worked, but only temporarily. Amy retreated from social media, but her bitterness remained. The damage she'd done to our family was irreparable, and the trust between us was shattered. In the end, I realized that Amy's version of family values was nothing more than a tool for her to get what she wanted. It was heartbreaking, but it was also a lesson I wouldn't forget. The first hint that Amy was about to escalate things came when I received a certified letter in the mail. At first, I thought it was some routine communication from the trust, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It was a notice informing me that Amy had filed a lawsuit against Aunt Lori, seeking to remove her as the trustee of my inheritance. I stared at the paper, unable to process what I was reading. I called Lori immediately. "She's suing you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. Lori sighed on the other end of the line. "I figured it might come to this. Amy's been desperate, and desperate people do irrational things. She's trying to take control of my money, isn't she?" I asked, the pieces clicking into place. "Pretty much," Lori said. "But don't worry. We've got the truth on our side." The legal process began with an avalanche of paperwork. Amy's lawyers alleged that Lori was unfit to manage the trust, accusing her of withholding funds and mishandling my inheritance. It was absurd, but in a legal battle, even baseless accusations had to be addressed. Lori's lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Green, assured us that we had a strong case. "She's grasping at straws," Evelyn said during our first meeting. "But we'll need to present solid evidence to shut this down quickly." The first court hearing was surreal. Amy walked in with a team of lawyers, her head held high as though she was the wronged party. She even had a few relatives with her, people she had managed to convince that Lori was some kind of villain hoarding money that could have saved Nick. I felt a pang of anger as I recognized our cousin Becca among them. Amy's opening argument was a masterpiece of manipulation. Her lawyer painted a picture of Lori as a cold, controlling figure who had abused her position of power to deny a grieving widow access to funds that could have saved her husband's life. Amy even got emotional on the stand, crying as she recounted how Nick had suffered while Lori hoarded my inheritance. It was all lies, of course, but it was hard to listen to. I clenched my fists under the table, feeling powerless as Amy played the victim. Evelyn countered with facts, and she did so brilliantly. She presented detailed records showing how Lori had managed the trust with impeccable care. Every deposit, withdrawal, and investment was documented, leaving no room for doubt about Lori's competence. Evelyn also introduced evidence of Amy's financial irresponsibility, luxury vacations that had cost over $50,000, tens of thousands of dollars spent on designer furniture, and receipts for high-end appliances that Amy had purchased within months of receiving her inheritance. The turning point came when Evelyn called me to the stand. I was nervous, but Evelyn had prepared me well. She asked me simple, straightforward questions about my relationship with Lori and how she had managed the trust. "Has your aunt ever denied you access to funds for legitimate needs?" Evelyn asked. "No," I replied. "She's always been supportive and transparent about the trust. And are you aware of how your sister has managed her own inheritance?" Evelyn continued. "Yes," I said, glancing at Amy, whose face was unreadable. "She spent it on luxury vacations, an expensive SUV, and redecorating her house." Amy's lawyer tried to rattle me during cross-examination, asking why I hadn't stepped in to help Nick when he needed surgery. It was a loaded question, designed to make me look selfish, but I stuck to the truth. "I wasn't in a position to help," I said firmly. "The trust is for my future, and it's not something I can access on a whim." The courtroom drama reached its peak when Evelyn presented a timeline of Amy's spending. She showed the court how Amy had burned through her $750,000 inheritance in less than a year, with no regard for the future. There were photos of Amy posing in front of her luxury SUV, receipts from high-end boutiques, and even screenshots of her social media posts bragging about her European vacations. Amy's lawyer tried to deflect, arguing that her spending habits were irrelevant to the case. But Evelyn wasn't having it. "This case is about responsibility," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "My client has upheld her duty as trustee with care and diligence, while the plaintiff has demonstrated a pattern of reckless behavior. This lawsuit isn't about justice, it's about desperation." The final blow came when Nick himself was called to testify. He looked tired and defeated as he took the stand. Amy had clearly roped him into this, but he didn't seem eager to be there. When Evelyn questioned him about the financial strain caused by his surgery, Nick admitted that Amy's spending had left them with no safety net. She wanted to redecorate the house, he said quietly. I told her we should save the money, but she didn't listen. It was a damning statement, and I could see the tension in Amy's face as Nick spoke. She looked like she wanted to leap out of her seat and silence him, but there was nothing she could do. The judge took several weeks to deliberate, but the verdict was clear. The lawsuit was dismissed, and Lori was allowed to remain as trustee. The judge even issued a statement condemning Amy's actions, calling her claims unsubstantiated and rooted in personal irresponsibility. After the ruling, Amy stormed out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone. I felt a mix of relief and sadness as I watched her go. She had been my sister once, someone I had looked up to, but now she was a stranger to me. Lori placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as we left the courthouse. It's over, she said. You can breathe now. But even as the legal battle ended, I knew the scars it left on our family would take much longer to heal. The courtroom was hushed as we waited for the judge to deliver the final verdict. It had been months of endless drama, legal filings, and courtroom confrontations. Amy's lawsuit had consumed our lives, dragging every unresolved family issue into the spotlight. I sat beside Aunt Lori, who was stoic as always, her composure unshaken even in the face of Amy's relentless attacks. I could feel my hands sweating as I clutched them tightly in my lap. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm and unyielding. After reviewing all the evidence presented, the court finds that Ms. Lori Anderson has acted in complete accordance with the terms outlined in Mr. William Thompson's will and trust. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. Relief washed over me as the weight of Amy's accusations began to lift. Lori gave me a small, reassuring smile, but I could tell even she wasn't celebrating yet. We knew there would be more to this ruling. The judge continued, furthermore, the court finds that the claims made by Ms. Amy Johnson were not only unfounded but constituted an abuse of the judicial system. This court does not take such matters lightly. Amy sat across the room, her face a storm cloud of emotions. She didn't meet my eyes. For months, she had paraded herself as the victim, twisting the narrative to suit her version of events. Now, the truth was finally out, and there was no escaping it. The next part of the judge's ruling was directed squarely at Amy. In light of the baseless nature of this lawsuit and the undue burden it has placed on the defendant and the court, Ms. Johnson is hereby fined $25,000 for abuse of the judicial process. Additionally, this court orders Ms. Johnson to undergo mandatory therapy for the duration of 1 year to address her behavior. I glanced at Amy as the words sank in. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She looked more humiliated than angry, which was a rare sight. I could almost feel sorry for her if I hadn't just spent months defending myself and Aunt Lori from her manipulations. The judge wasn't finished. Finally, due to Ms. Johnson's persistent harassment and the distress caused to Mr. Ethan Thompson and Ms. Lori Anderson, this court grants a restraining order. Ms. Johnson is to have no contact with either party for the next 3 years. That was the nail in the coffin. Amy's face turned pale, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she looked genuinely shaken. The realization that she couldn't just barge into our lives anymore must have been sinking in. Aunt Lori exhaled softly beside me, her shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time in weeks. The courtroom emptied quickly after the ruling, but Amy lingered, glaring daggers at us from across the room. She muttered something to her lawyer before storming out, her high heels clicking angrily against the floor. I didn't expect her to go quietly, and I was right. The aftermath of the trial was a whirlwind. Reporters had caught wind of the case, thanks to Amy's public posts on social media, and a small crowd waited outside the courthouse. As we stepped into the sunlight, cameras flashed, and voices called out questions. Lori ignored them, her head held high, but I felt the heat of their attention and kept my eyes on the ground. Ms. Anderson, do you have any comment on the judge's decision? One reporter shouted. Do you feel vindicated? Another asked. Lori paused, just for a moment, before turning to address them. The court has spoken. My brother trusted me to carry out his wishes, and I've done so to the best of my ability. That's all I have to say. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that left no room for further questioning. The reporters backed off slightly, and we made our way to Lori's car. The fallout from the ruling was immediate. Amy's $25,000 fine was a significant blow, especially since she'd already squandered her inheritance. It didn't take long for the cracks in her story to become public knowledge. Some of the same relatives who had supported her began to distance themselves when they realized how much she had lied. Even our cousin Becca, who had been one of Amy's staunchest defenders, called me a week later to apologize. "I had no idea she was making all that up," Becca said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I thought she just wanted to help Nick." "Don't worry about it," I said, though it was hard to let go of the resentment. Amy's good at making people believe her. Nick, however, was conspicuously absent from the chaos. After the trial, I heard through the grapevine that he had filed for divorce. It didn't surprise me. He'd been through enough, and I could only imagine how much strain Amy had put on their marriage. Lori and I tried to return to some semblance of normal life, but the effects of Amy's actions lingered. The restraining order gave us some peace of mind, but I couldn't help but feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Amy had always been persistent, and I doubted she would go down without a fight. One evening, about a month after the trial, I came home to find Lori sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of letters. She looked up when I walked in, her expression a mix of amusement and frustration. "More apologies," she said, holding up one of the envelopes. "Your Aunt Karen wants to rebuild bridges." I rolled my eyes. Karen had been one of Amy's most vocal supporters during the trial. And what did she say about believing Amy's lies? "Nothing specific," Lori said with a smirk. "Just a lot of vague talk about family unity and moving forward." I laughed, but there was a bitter edge to it. "Funny how people only want unity after they've picked a side." Lori nodded. "People like Amy thrive on chaos. Once the chaos settles, everyone else is left scrambling to clean up the mess." The mandatory therapy was perhaps the only silver lining in the entire ordeal. From what I heard, Amy wasn't happy about it, but she had no choice but to comply. The therapist, a stern woman named Dr. Evelyn Harper, didn't let her off easy. I only knew this because Amy's few remaining allies, people like Aunt Karen, leaked bits and pieces of their sessions. "She's been talking about your dad a lot," Karen told me during one of her attempts to reconcile. "Dr. Harper thinks she has unresolved issues with him." "That's not an excuse," I said, my tone firm. "We all have issues, but that doesn't give her the right to do what she did." Karen nodded, looking chastened. "I just thought you'd want to know." I didn't want to know, but I appreciated the update. It wasn't like I could ask Amy myself, not with the restraining order in place. And honestly, I didn't want to talk to her. Therapy or not, I wasn't ready to forgive her for everything she had put us through. In the end, the ruling felt like both a victory and a loss. Amy was finally held accountable for her actions, and Lori's reputation had been vindicated. But the family we had once been was gone, fractured beyond repair. I wasn't sure if we'd ever find our way back to each other, but for now, I was content with the peace that came from knowing Lori and I had done the right thing. As I sat with Lori that evening, watching the sun set over her backyard, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't painless, but it was enough. And after everything we'd been through, that was all I could ask for. After the legal battle and everything Amy put us through, I could finally breathe again. The inheritance, which had been both a lifeline and a curse, was safe. Aunt Lori had remained as trustee, exactly as my father intended, and I was finally able to look forward to a future I had been too afraid to plan for. For the first time in years, I felt like I could focus on my dream, medical school. Growing up, I'd always been fascinated by medicine. My dad used to joke that I was the only kid who preferred science kits to video games. He was proud of my ambition and had always encouraged me to aim high. After his death, that dream had felt distant, buried under the weight of grief and Amy's constant turmoil. But now, with the trust intact and Lori's unwavering support, I could see the path ahead clearly. The first step was meeting with financial advisors to map out a plan. Lori arranged a meeting with a man named Richard Carmichael, a meticulous, no-nonsense advisor who specialized in managing trusts. I was nervous going into the meeting, but Richard quickly put me at ease. Your father left you a remarkable gift, Richard said, flipping through spreadsheets and charts. If managed wisely, this money can fund your education, support you through your residency, and still leave a significant nest egg for the future. We spent hours going over the details. Richard explained how the investments Lori had made with the trust had performed exceptionally well, growing the original $750,000 into nearly $900,000. I was floored. Lori had always been cautious, but I hadn't realized just how competent she was as a financial steward. I felt a wave of gratitude toward her for protecting my future so fiercely. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Richard said as we wrapped up the meeting. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. While my future was beginning to take shape, Amy's life was unraveling. The fallout from the court's decision hit her hard. The $25,000 fine had been a devastating blow to her finances, which were already in shambles after years of reckless spending. Nick, who had quietly endured Amy's drama for far too long, finally filed for divorce. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved in with his parents and was focused on rebuilding his life. Amy, meanwhile, had become something of a pariah within the family. The relatives who had initially supported her during the lawsuit were now keeping their distance, embarrassed by the role they had played in her campaign against Lori and me. Even Aunt Karen, who had been one of Amy's most vocal allies, stopped defending her. She called me the other day. Karen confessed during a rare phone call. She wanted to borrow money. I told her no. I wasn't surprised. Amy had burned through every bridge she had, and now she was facing the consequences. Part of me felt sorry for her, but another part of me knew that she had brought this on herself. There was no joy in seeing her fail, only a lingering sadness for what could have been.